Good evening. Can you all hear me? Is this on? Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the McConnell Center. My name is Anna Cecile Pepper, and I'm a sophomore scholar here at the McConnell Center. We're glad you're here. And hello to those joining us over webcast. If you have any questions, please tweet them in to @ULM McConnell Center. Okay, first, I have the privilege of introducing Dr. Daniel Krebs. For tonight's lecture, the McConnell Center is proud to partner with the University of Louisville's Vietnam War Commemoration Committee. And here representing that committee is Dr. Krebs himself from our Department of History. Dr. Krebs is a military historian. His research focuses on early American warfare and captivity. He teaches a variety of courses, among them a U.S. military history, which is also part of the Army ROTC curriculum. Let's give him a warm welcome.
Thanks, Pepper. First of all, thank you all for coming. Really appreciate that, and I'm really excited to see so many students. I'm really excited to see, especially also so many. Is this on? Hello? Yeah. To see so many veterans here and so many faces that I've seen before at some of our lectures. So really, thank you very much for coming. I just wanted to take a minute to say quickly something about the University of Louisville's Vietnam War commemoration effort. For about 2 years, this year and also next year, we are organizing a series of events, lectures, and all other things to commemorate Vietnam veterans and their effort and their families, and to honor them and their service in Vietnam. So that is a commitment that the University of Louisville made to the United States military, and we're doing this since spring now. We had a presentation by South Vietnamese veterans. Now we're excited to have here Josiah Bunting here, a U.S. Army veteran of Vietnam. And this is already a little bit of a teaser for spring. We're probably going to look at a lecture about the Tet Offensive by a professor at the University of Kentucky. So you see, we do a lot of things here about Vietnam and to honor Vietnam veterans and their families and their service. So that is one part of why I'm speaking here. The other part is this lecture is also a part of a 3-lecture series this semester that I was able to organize together with the McConnell Center. And let me for that really thank the McConnell Center for what they're doing, the kind of, and yes, money they're putting into these kinds of events, the kind of efforts their staff is making. So really thank you very much for that. Without them, that would not be possible. So really, and Gary he's here, so really, why don't we all just, give them a hand here, because they're doing something really amazing here. That 3-part lecture series is about America at the end of war. And as a military historian, of course, academics, we like to make, big, look at the big picture here. And what I wanted to do with these 3 lectures, one on the War of 1812, one on the Civil War, and one now on Vietnam, is to look at the end of war. Because military historians have done a tremendous job in explaining the conduct of operations, the planning of war. What we're struggling a little bit as military historians is look at the end of the war, at the aftermath, and that turns out to be often way more complicated and complex than previously anticipated. And I'm pretty sure that Josiah Bunting will probably hit on one of those themes as well. That the aftermath of war is often something that turns out to be very complicated. So that is the overall idea behind that. And I see some of you have been here for the other 2 lectures. Thank you very much again for coming, and I'm looking forward to now an amazing lecture by Josiah Bunting. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Krebs. It is now my privilege to introduce General Josiah Bunting III. Before the event, I had the pleasure of speaking with him, and he told me to introduce him in 2 sentences or less, but that is indeed impossible for a man of his credentials. General Bunting is the president of the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation in New York City. And before taking up his duties at the foundation, he served as the superintendent at his alma mater, the Virginia Military Institute in Lexington, Virginia. After his graduation from VMI and commissioning in the regular Army, Mr. Bunting studied at the University of Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, taking a degree in modern history, subsequently serving in the 9th Infantry Division in Vietnam, and as an assistant professor in history at West Point, and completing his military service in 1972, was appointed as a professor of strategy at the Naval War College. Before returning to VMI, he served as president of Hampton-Sydney College in Virginia and as headmaster of the Lawrenceville School in New Jersey. Among Mr. Bunting's books is a biography written for Arthur Schleisinger's presidential series on Ulysses S. Grant. He is currently completing a biography of George C. Marshall, Army Chief of Staff during World War II, Secretary of State, and Secretary of Defense. In 2012, he was elected chairman of the English-Speaking Union of the United States, and in 2014, he was elected chairman of Friends of the National World War II Memorial Incorporated. Mr. Bunting has served on the boards of the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Revolution Center, and is currently a trustee in the Intercollegiate Studies Institute in Washington, Delaware. He is married to the former Diana Margaret Cunningham, and they have 4 children and live on a farm in Virginia. I had the pleasure of working with General Bunting this summer during the Strategic Broadening Seminar, which is a program put on by the McConnell Center, the Pentagon, and the Army. He was one of the soldiers' favorite speakers, and he spoke on George C. Marshall and Thucydides. And if I really had to introduce General Bunting in one sentence, I would say he is a man of honor and integrity, humility, and strength, and it is truly our pleasure to have him here with us this evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all very much. Can you hear me in the back? We were trained to say that at Fort Benning. I'm glad. Every time you hug a GI in the airport in Louisville or Charlotte or New York or wherever you are, you know that he is a volunteer. The military draft stopped on December 31st, 1972. And when we ask what were the consequences of the war in Vietnam, that was one of them. We went to an all-volunteer force, and since that time, the volunteer force has been populated by many wonderful young men and women whom most of us feel constrained either to hug or to shake their hand and thank them for their service, even though in this very complicated period in our history, we're not exactly sure of what that service consists of. I wish that we had some form of a draft, and I wish that whatever form of the draft we had involved some early military service. The fashion now, and this is kind of a weasel phrase, is, well, I think everybody should do something. But service in the American military is a precious and honorable thing. And to use another reference, which I think fits this, I once asked the head of Teach for America, this program that sends bright young kids off to teach in places that don't have a tradition of good young teaching. I asked her if she expected those people would be career teachers. And she said, no, alas, most of them won't. But they'll be in the Senate, they'll be in the House, they'll be in government, they'll be on school boards. They will understand what it is they are asking young teachers to do. And I think that's important for the future of the way we deal with our military, to have a cohort of people in the House, in the Senate, perhaps even in the Oval Office, who have had some experience in that, if you will, line of work. In the last couple of years, one of the networks is taken to presenting 1-hour programs for different decades. The last one I saw was called The 60s. And that leads me to talk about Vietnam, because the 60s, the way it was presented to the audiences that watched it, and these were big, big audiences, missed the first 4 or 5 years of the decade. They had them all wrong. The 60s they depicted began about 1966 and ended about 1975. The early 1960s, and I was a college student at that time, was the time of John F. Kennedy. There are probably people here old enough to remember his inaugural address. We will pay any price, bear any burden. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. This was a time of unmitigated idealism. People wanted to be Green Berets, they wanted to be priests, they wanted to get PhDs in philosophy, they wanted to be in the Peace Corps. This was before the CNN version of the 60s. Ironically, it was that early idealism of the 60s that led us towards our early involvement in Vietnam. And that early involvement really had begun in the time of Harry Truman, the beginning of what we called the Truman Doctrine, the understanding that international communism had to be dealt with, and in some instances, dealt with on the battlefield. The first example of that, of course, occurred in June 1950 when we made the decision and went to the UN immediately for UN backing to stop the communist invasion, the northern Korean invasion of South Korea. That sense was alive until the mid-60s, certainly, and it led us in a very tortuous and quiet and almost unremarkable way into a full-fledged engagement in Vietnam. Next week on Veterans Day, the 11th of November, we will honor all of our American veterans. The veterans of World War II, where we lost about 395,000 killed and almost 1.5 million wounded, they will be represented by a dwindling cohort of men and a few women in their 90s. The audience response to them is one of enormous, palpable thankfulness and gratitude. Somehow, the country remembers, has trained itself to remember, that that generation unified the country in an effort that everybody believed was necessary. Hitler must be stopped. The Axis powers must be dealt with, and we must deal with them until they come home, until our soldiers come home safe. We admire them for the period in which they served. We also admire them for a quality which we don't hear talked about much in our country anymore: humility and modesty. Everyone has a picture of a GI on the mantelpiece somewhere in her house, in his house. That generation commends itself not only because of what they are and what they represent, but because we have a sense that at that time when we went to war, everybody knew it was necessary. And at the beginning of our engagement in Vietnam, everybody felt the same way. We got in by degrees. We needed advisors. We should advise the South Vietnamese government. You remember that the country was separated in 1954 by the Geneva Accords. The North, all of this had been a French colony. The North, under, by that time, largely communist rule, or communist rule beginning, and the South under the Diem family. We believed that at the early instance of Viet Cong activity, any activity which seemed to threaten the South Vietnamese, we must involve ourselves, but at least initially by giving military aid and sending in advisors. We get involved, however, in wars in ways that we don't expect or plan for, and Vietnam was a classic example. A year or so later, in the Gulf of Tonkin, which is immediately off the coast of North Vietnam, American destroyers were attacked by North Vietnamese gunboats. What actually happened at that time, we are not sure, but it enabled President Lyndon Johnson to go to the Congress and seek approval to take all measures necessary to do what is required to eliminate whatever North Vietnamese threat may pose to the South. That seemed to make sense at the time. We had the idea, certainly, that what was being done in North Vietnam was connected either to Moscow or Beijing or both. The idea that some people offered in contrary-wise was that perhaps Ho Chi Minh was somebody we could deal with. Perhaps we could make him an Asian Tito. We could make him our friendly communist. That didn't get very far. Gradually, we increased our involvement. By the time of the Tet Offensive, and I'll say something about that in a moment because it's the midpoint and urgently important period in Vietnam, we were upwards of 500,000 soldiers. Ultimately, we had 575,000 soldiers. And when my little cohort of 300 or 400 people got off the rented Braniff jetliner in San Francisco in December 1968, the first thing we heard was, and I can hear the voice again, and I will quote it for you, "You gentlemen be well advised to change into civilian attire before leaving the post." Isn't that terrible? At the time, we didn't think it was terrible. We thought, yeah, whatever, let's go home. But that was essentially our sense by that time of what the country thought of the war in Vietnam. I was in the Mekong Delta with the 9th Infantry Division. One of our brigades, 3 infantry battalions aggregating, let's say, 14 or 15,000 men, I beg your pardon, 14 or 1,500 men, we were on ships. And we spent most of our time patrolling the Bassac, or the Mekong River, using intelligence which we gathered basically from allies in the South to figure out where the Viet Cong were operating, then to go ashore in monitors or Mike 8 boats, locate them and engage them as infantry. Our artillery came along with us, barge artillery, 105s, which have an effective range of 3 or 4 miles. We figured out fairly quickly that the Viet Cong knew exactly where we were going and what we were coming with. And we had many difficult months trying to engage them and do what needed to be done. While this was going on in the Mekong Delta, the Marines, who should, in my opinion, have been where we were operating in I Corps in some of the most savage fighting of the war, with extended American casualty lists. The commanders of all of these operations were general officers, good men and true, who had learned their trade on the plains of Northern Europe in World War II, and who were prepared, basically, when they went there, to fight very much in that mode. We were fighting an enemy which was not up to or down to, whatever phrase you want to use, that kind of combat. The enemy understood, and I had a conversation with a former North Vietnamese officer in Saigon, I'll mention that in a moment, understood exactly that their mission was not to prevail militarily, but to, as we would say, hang in there until our support at home, which they were able to learn about and watch on television, just like everybody else, or certainly hear about, until that support wavered. And that support wavered with the introduction of the word Vietnamization in the presidential election campaign of 1968. Richard Nixon used that word. As soon as an alert enemy soldier, enemy politician heard the word Vietnamization, he must, in my imagination, have breathed a sigh of relief, because we were telegraphing that we were gradually going to withdraw, to draw down our forces. And once that happened, then it was a matter of time from their perspective. A couple of years later, I was in the USSR, and I met a couple of Russian soldiers who had had, quote, their quotation, the same experience you fellows had in Vietnam, in Afghanistan. That is to say, we were sent off on a mission which was, if not a fool's errand, certainly an errand which could not be explained in a way to sustain support for it. What was it like in Vietnam in combat? What were American soldiers like at that time? Overwhelmingly, where we were, they were draftees. The paratroop divisions that served over there, the 101st, elements of the 82nd, they were mainly volunteers. The American soldier, as a draftee or a volunteer, is a great, great soldier. And when I hear people say that they're much happier with an all-volunteer force because draftees are not as skilled and not as up for the mission, I don't believe that. You shoot at an American soldier in a combat situation, he always behaves himself and serves very much in the tradition of the United States Armed Services. Later in the war, and we're now talking about 1967-68, I remember the North Koreans shanghaied, if that's an appropriate word, an American, what was it, a destroyer, a cruiser, called the Pueblo. And we thought to ourselves, this is it, we're going to be here for a very long time. The whole Far East will be at war, and we'll be here for God knows how long. That did not amount to anything, but in 1968, thanks to the fact that most Americans were watching what we were doing every night in television, we sensed that our support at home was faltering. 1968, in a PBS program, was called The Late Great 1968. The argument was that maybe that was the worst year in our history since World War II. Many of you are able to remember what the politics of that period were like. I taught a seminar this afternoon in Dr. Gregg's program on the Greek historian Thucydides. And Thucydides, talking about Athens fighting against Sparta, mentions that the first casualty at home in a country in whose behalf you were fighting is the unwillingness to listen and have patient debate and arguments leading to some form of useful conclusion. That happened here. Some of you must remember it. If you were not full of support for what was happening in Vietnam on our part, you must be some kind of a simpering coward, or vice versa. If you wanted us to sustain our work in Vietnam, you must be a fascist pig. This is the casualty of that kind of war. I think this kind of war is what we are likely to find ourselves serving in the future. I hate to say that, but it makes me think that you get into wars by degrees without calculating what the costs are going to be. Everybody is enthusiastic about the necessity, but they don't quite foresee what's going to happen down the road. Well, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial now commemorates the service of these men and women. They have largely been forgotten by the country. The country remembers what it knows of World War I and World War II. The country is preoccupied with Al-Qaeda and ISIS and those kinds of things. But we owe an enormous debt to those who went to Vietnam and gave and did not count the cost and came home, most of them. So that's my recollection of Vietnam. And to use a vulgar phrase, if you're looking for a takeaway, I think the lesson learned is we have to be goddamned sure what our mission is the next time we commit ourselves to serve in some foreign field. The soldiers who served there, especially those who paid the ultimate price, deserve our undying gratitude. They have never received the credit, the praise, and the honor that they deserve. So we can begin right now giving it to them. Yes. Yeah.
We will now be taking questions for the general. So, do we have any?
You answered my question right off the beginning, and I agree with you 100%.
Thank you, sir. Yes, yes, ma'am.
What ideas would you have for implementing a draft today, and how would it begin?
Yeah. We're a country of 341 million. In World War II, we were a country of 135 million. So you're dealing with a cohort of 18, 19, 20-year-olds, which is enormous. I think, first of all, any form of conscription or draft has to be deferment-free. You must, between the ages of, let's say, 18 and 25, give the country a year or 18 months or 2 years of service. And that service can take many forms, and if you pardon the fractured verb, we can incentivize some members of that cohort to serve in uniform, because obviously not everybody is motivated to do that. But I do feel very strongly that these rising generations need to have the experience of serving the United States in some way. And I think you could, with the military, find an ample number of draftees who were up for that service. You didn't ask this question, but if I were on active duty in the Army now, the first thing I would do is put those kids into great uniforms and make them look like Gregory Peck, for God's sake. I mean, the Marines do that. Why can't we do that? I see these poor kids, and the things don't even fit them. You want a young man to have, and a young woman to have pride in, don't you feel that way? I mean, I know they serve with valor in Afghanistan, but, make them look the role. Yes, sir.
When I was growing up as a teenager, I can still remember that when you came back from Vietnam, you had mentioned in '68 that, you take your uniform off before you left the post and stuff, and a lot of negative comments, terrible things that have been said about soldiers that served in Vietnam. But it seems like, I guess maybe in the 80s, maybe I'm missing this, there was a shift in the perception of the people that actually served in Vietnam.
Yeah.
Can you attribute
Yeah.
what made that shift from what being negative to...
I was aware of that, and thank God it happened, and we now have the Vietnam Wall of Remembrance and all of that. I think people began to think, the more they met Vietnam veterans, and the more Vietnam veterans moved around the country, we owe these guys something. And when that happened, I think that the fact that we no longer had a draft, it was in the decade of the 80s. I'm anxious to see what CNN will make of the 80s. Who says you can't have it all, that kind of thing. I think a guilty conscience had a lot to do with the respect that we now have for Vietnam veterans. In my work at the World War II Memorial, I find that most Americans over the age of roughly 50 cannot differentiate in age people older than they are. I was asked the other day, what was my unit at Normandy? And I said, well, I was in the bassinet. But, and I keep meeting these Vietnam people I think are Vietnam veterans. I always say, what were you, a drummer boy? The Vietnam vet, the average guy who was 18 in, 1968 is now, you can do the math. So we are, most of us now, in positions where we can speak up for ourselves. But I do worry that we don't have anyone in Congress or in government. Any of the presidential, all those 38 people competing for the presidency, are they veterans? I'm trying to think which one. They're all too young. Yeah, they're all, well, yeah. That's right.
They're not too young if they volunteer.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
They would be just right.
Yeah. Did West, I guess he dropped out, didn't he? Yeah. I once went to a breakfast and heard West speak. He was running for the Senate in Virginia. I thought he was a Republican. And,
He wasn't, man.
Was he at one time?
Yeah, he's been everything.
Yeah, yeah. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
So growing up, the daughter of a baby boomer, often heard my mom say that the country just doesn't have the stomach for war. Would you disagree or agree with that? And also, how do you think social media and media in general has skewed the nation's view of wartime?
The first part of my answer has to do with the university community. If you want to guarantee in a so-called elite university, elite private university up in the Northeast, you want to guarantee you will not receive tenure, try majoring in military history or being a military history professor. The academic community looks down on that profession, that branch of history, until roughly 1960, 1965, along with diplomatic history, social, it was one of the things that everybody studied. You were expected to study that. So basically, the cohort of people that are university professors of that age, along with most of what we would call the intellectual apparatus in this country, is down on military study and war generally, even when necessary. And how would you go about changing it? By finding people, electing people, appointing people who think to the contrary. You know, again, we talked about this Greek historian, and he mentioned, Thucydides, that one of the first casualties is thoughtful discussion about issues like this. Are you writing about George Marshall in World War II? You must be some kind of a fascist. Are you a friend of Dick Cheney? That kind of thought is going to take us a long time to get rid of that. You know what your country thought of you after World War II? What our country thought of us? When Marshall, who led the Army and was the author of the Marshall Plan, attended as the representative of President Eisenhower the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, who is still the Queen. When he was led to his seat in Westminster Abbey, congregation stood up. That's what we looked like at that time. And we were blessed with not only the greatest generation of soldiers, but a great, great generation of leaders, including FDR. It is something that's going to take a long time, and it's going to take, it seems to me, people in responsible public positions who have had some of that experience. There are people here old enough to remember the early 60s, the part of the 60s that they didn't talk about. That was a great time to be alive, you know? And yes, sir.
You wrote a novel about you wrote a novel. Is it on? You wrote a novel about your experiences, or following your experiences in Vietnam. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? What you're trying to achieve?
The novel was it was called The Lionheads, and it was a book about an infantry unit in the Mekong Delta, which had, because of decisions made in Washington, was caused to do things for which it was not suited. The Riverine Force was trying to demonstrate it could operate very well without helicopters. They badly needed helicopter support, and it was withdrawn from them. The novel had three characters: a general, a young captain, and a private. The private was killed as a consequence. It's not a happy novel. Incidentally, if you want to read military history and military fiction, the great gift, the great literary gift of the Second World War is the war novel. There are probably 15 or 20 of them that are famous. Most of them have been made into movies, and they're all the same. There's a squad that has a black man, a Jew, an Episcopalian, a lumberjack, a sadistic sergeant from Mississippi, a Chicago, and they all come together, and guess what? At the end of the book, they love each other. World War II. Yes, sir. I know that the two ugly Ohio cities are playing football against each other tonight, so not too many more. Sir.
First off, I'd say welcome home, brother.
Thank you.
Second, I would say, how come our military establishment has not learned a lesson from Vietnam and still takes us places and has no intent of winning, just going there to enforce, we're not sure what?
I think it's, I appreciate that question very much. If you look at pictures, the World War II pictures of conferences, you see Churchill and Roosevelt, and part of the time Stalin, the Russians were our allies, and standing around them are senior American, Soviet, and English general officers and admirals. There's no such thing as a 41-year-old PhD in systems analysis. They wanted judgment, they wanted experience, and they listened to it. I think that's the first part of the answer. The second part is the Army, because it was so small in the 1920s and 1930s, presented very few command opportunities. So bright young officers were left pretty much alone to follow their own idiosyncrasies and interests. And as a consequence, when World War II began, or within a year of the beginning of World War II, we had a cohort of young generals who were extraordinarily talented people. And most of them were eccentric. And not a few of them had had affairs. There was no Wolf Blitzer living at that time. If you misbehaved in those days, you got a letter from Marshall saying, knock it off, return to your unit. So I think that has a lot to do with the quality of political decisions made with astute military advice. Incidentally, also at that time, military officers almost invariably never voted. It was something they did not do, that they served the interest of the country, whether it was FDR or whoever it was. With that. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Was the Tet Offensive of 1968 as successful militarily as the media in the United States made it out to be? And was it the dagger that eventually led to our withdrawal from Vietnam?
It's a very good question. The answer to the first question was no, and the second question is yes. The Tet Offensive on the ground, at least where we were, had very, very little significance. But at home, it had enormous significance because it was all shown on television, especially the flashy parts. Look, they're in the American embassy, that kind of thing. And of course, that's a new condition that political leadership has to deal with. Everybody at home can see what's happening, or at least think they can see what's happening. And the Tet Offensive, from a military point of view, was a tactical American victory up and down all of Vietnam, except in a couple of places which were on the TV screen all the time. I've been back, by the way. Has anyone here been back to Saigon or Ho Chi Minh City? Yeah. It's quite something to see. You would think you were in Sacramento or Los Angeles, someplace like that.
My daughter works in Singapore,
Yeah.
and she goes there frequently, and
Yeah.
just can't believe it.
They have become us. I spend a lot of time in Wyoming in the summertime, and I occasionally meet people who say, I love Wyoming. And I say, where have you been? Well, we were at the Four Seasons in Jackson Hole. When you go back to Vietnam, for those of you who are veterans, try to get out and see everything, and especially see where you were. You'll be amazed at the changes. Yes, sir.
I want to give a slightly different perspective to yours. With all due respect, especially with respect to Tet, it was a military defeat for NVA-VC forces, but United States public opinion was set up by the political leadership to expect that the light was at the end of the tunnel, that they were on their last legs, that they were totally decimated. So when they rose up in all those cities from, Way to Quezon to Saigon, we weren't prepared for it, and we knew at that time if many hadn't already come to the recognition that both the military and the political leadership was lying to the American people.
Yeah.
So even though our forces managed to prevail in 68, 69, I think the setback was not just because they were weak and we were strong, but because it was a major contrast effect. Similarly, with respect to post-Vietnam studies, unfortunately, the majority of the consumers of them seem to like a simplified rendition of it. We were right, they were wrong.
Yeah.
And that's why a lot of the professors don't enter into it, because these feelings still remain. And if you try to give a differentiated view, the right hates you and the left hates you. So I think there's reason for people still staying away from it, and we may still need time to heal from that. I think there's still good work being done in military history currently.
Your point is well taken, and I can't help interjecting this because I've had some experience with it. The greatest thing Franklin Roosevelt ever did was the GI Bill. And that generation of drafted GIs who came home and who became, large numbers of them became high school teachers and college professors. And they were a great, great cohort of teachers. And they were essentially frank and forthright and thoughtful in their presentation of their own experience. There was no hatred of military or anything like that. When we lost the last of that generation of teachers, we lost a lot. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for your talk and your service. You mentioned earlier the virtues of humility and modesty, and I'm wondering what you think we can do to encourage those virtues today, and then also how they relate to taking pride in our country.
What a great question. If you look at the greatest generation, and you look at the way they were raised, the family was very important. Typically, the mother or father read to the children at night. A large number of people that we honor and revere from World War II grew up on farms. This is where you learn self-reliance, responsibility, working hard for the greater good without expectation of reward, those kind of things. I think that's the most important thing of all. We tend to think if Melissa gets into Princeton, I can have the orange and black sticker on the back of my German car, and God knows what's going to happen. She can run a hedge fund. That's all wrong. Everybody must agree with that. It's what happens, it seems to me, between the ages of 3 and 15 or something like that that makes the difference. As far as having pride in their country, we can encourage that also, but I think it has to be encouraged at home and in school and in churches, because we're certainly not going to get it from Wolf Blitzer. He's the only one whose name I can remember. It's a beautiful little boy. Let's call him Wolf, you know. And the other thing, you know, we talked about this today. Napoleon, of all people, said, most important thing to learn if you're going to be a public person, in his case he's thinking about military people, is to learn how to focus quietly on a single issue for a long time without growing fatigued. There's a cartoon in the New Yorker showing a Harvard graduation last summer, and every kid going up to receive her diploma, I can demonstrate it to you, is doing this. You know, I mean, the old version of word processor was this. In other words, this is a generation of kids that really don't know how to be thoughtful and quiet and think things through, and then be self-reliant in the actions that they take from what they have thought. Let me just add a codicil to that. We tend to hear it said, Smith isn't that bright, but she has a good character. That's all wrong. Character and mind are deeply interpenetrated. They're part of the same thing. Do you see what I'm saying? In other words, character says, wait a minute, have you thought about so-and-so? Are you patiently examining all of the evidence? Those kinds of things. You can believe that the first sentence in every chapter 2 of every biography about a famous West Point graduate, here is the first sentence. Although a mediocre student at West Point, comma, Smith, blah, blah, blah. No, he wasn't a mediocre student. He was doing what he thought was useful to him. This is not a popular name to mention here, but Ulysses Grant spent most of his time painting and reading authors like James Fenimore Cooper. One last thing, having mentioned Grant, let me mention his great and famous rival. Every American school child ought to be made to read the last sentence and memorize the last sentence of the farewell to the Army of Northern Virginia. General Orders Number 9, right after Appomattox. You will take with you the satisfaction that proceeds from the consciousness of duty faithfully performed, period. That's it. No Oprah, no Lexus with a heated steering wheel, no house in the Hamptons. Satisfaction of duty performed. That's the way we have to raise children, in my opinion. Thank you very much. Yes, sir. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
I heard the name Josiah Bunting in the fall of 1963 as a rap.
Wow.
Okay.
Okay.
And it's my pleasure to finally meet you.
Thank you.
And you've exceeded my expectations
Thank you.
as a well-balanced VMI graduate.
Thank you, sir.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
Thank you so
My name
much.
is Lee Steelman.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much for speaking with us, General Bunting, and thank you also for your service. Here is a small token from the McConnell Center, and tonight we are also doing a book drawing for the book The Lion's Head that was previously mentioned by Dr. Krebs.
Thank you.
And so, General Bunting, would you do the honor of
sure.
pulling out the name for us?
Okay.
We have Debbie Stubble. Thank you all so much for being with us. Have a great evening.
Thanks for the introduction.
Thank
It was
you.
great. It was great. Thank you.
You sound very much like my friend Tony Zinni.
Yeah, he's a good friend of mine.
He's a very
He was on the fact.
In many ways exceeds, I think, the one in Washington. For those that haven't seen it, very dynamic.
Yeah, I'm going to be there.